This video is part of a series reviewing Young Justice. However, if you are only interested in a review of Young Justice Invasion, this video can be viewed on its own. A link to the first part of my Young Justice series can be found in the description. Spoilers for the entirety of Young Justice's first and second seasons will follow. Thank you for watching. In my review of Young Justice's first season, the very first thing I said was that it is ambitious. In some ways, this second season is simpler, but in most ways, this show has only gotten more complicated and, well, ambitious. While this sort of risk-taking is somewhat admirable, there's good and bad that comes with that. Unfortunately, in my opinion, Young Justice Invasion is a prime example of the bad side of that. Now, before I go any further, I just want to say this. If you love Young Justice Invasion, that's awesome. You are in no way wrong for liking or even loving this show, and I'm actually really happy that you got a sequel that you enjoy. This is just the opinion of one random guy on the internet. Anyway, without further ado, let's talk about why I think Young Justice Invasion is a disappointment. Time skips often get a bad rap, but they aren't always bad. Actually, some skips in time are usually necessary in a story. It's exceptionally rare that we're going to see everything a character does, or that there won't be any lulls in the characters' lives. These time skips are the ones that I often don't even think of as, well, time skips. Then there are the more in-between time skips, the ones that aren't so bad but that I still personally don't like. One example of this would be a character going to train somewhere and then skipping forward to when they're done with their training, when they've come out of that stronger. When that sort of thing happens, I can't help but feel that I would have liked to see them grow, or that there could have been a better way of showing that change. Then there are the bad time skips, the confusing, convoluted ones that almost never work. Skipping forward when nothing all that important to the story is happening is understandable, but sometimes a story will skip over incredibly important information. Stuff like a hero becoming a villain, or a character's moral compass changing drastically, or a relationship between two characters breaking down. And yes, those are all examples from Young Justice Invasion, because this season starts off after a 5-year time skip, and a lot has happened in that period of time. So let's start by going over what's changed with the main characters of Young Justice's first season: Robin, Miss Martian, Superboy, Kid Flash, Artemis, and Aqualad, and talk about the effects this time skip has on the audience's understanding of their characters. First, the original season's Robin has become Nightwing and there's a new Robin. This is a poor time skip. Robin, or Nightwing now, has changed a lot. He's not who he used to be. Now he's able to take over for Aqualad and do his job. While the idea that this role would be passed on to Nightwing was established and explored a bit in Season 1, we don't see the actual things Nightwing does to become a better leader. There's a whole lot of change here that we're just supposed to shrug our shoulders at and go, okay, I guess he's a better leader now. Even if this feels like the natural end to his arc, moving from poor leader to follower to good leader, we missed all that character change that makes this payoff interesting. Miss Martian's change is even more extreme. She now uses her psychic powers liberally, brain blasting any enemy she comes across, so long as it seems useful given the situation. Again, this feels like a potential end to her arc. After all, she knocked out her friends and attacked Simon in the first season. But still, this is so different from who she was. On top of that, other things she did ended up counteracting that arc. I mean, she showed that she's a white Martian. She confronted that part of herself, that fear that they wouldn't accept her. So how did she get here? What happened to her? What decisions did she make? Just like with Nightwing, the payoff is only a payoff if something is done to build up to that. In other words, the consequences are important, but so are the actions that characters take that lead to those consequences. Of course, this is made even worse by the fact that Miss Martian's and Superboy's relationship has broken down. While what happened between them is revealed through Superboy's and Miss Martian's conversations, that's once again the type of thing the audience should see. So much of Season 1 was focused on their relationship, and even if I started off not being horribly fond of how Young Justice handled romance, by the end, hers and Superboy's relationship was key to both of their characters. It was exceptionally important, and skipping to this point is just jarring. In my mind, the time skip makes the most sense for Kid Flash and Artemis, but I still don't like it. Yeah, them still being together but no longer wanting to be heroes is far more in line with Season 1 than what's happened with Miss Martian and Superboy, but it's still a serious change for their characters. Both of them were pretty invested in being heroes, right up until the end of the season. Even if I can come up with a lot of good reasons why they would give up being superheroes, I would rather see what happened that led them to this point. Did something even more dangerous occur? Were they just tired? Were they too worried for one another's safety? I don't exactly know. Besides, that could be a really great moment. The moment where they both agree to give up on this for each other. Again, we see the consequences of characters' decisions, but not how they actually came to those decisions. Regardless of if it's easy to come up with reasons, and regardless of if the decision seems reasonable, if it involves a significant change within these characters, it's probably a good idea to show that to the audience. Then there's Aqualad, who we're supposed to believe has betrayed the team because the love of his life died, and because he learned that his father is Black Manta. Now, that would be one hell of an arc to see. Of course, that's not actually what's happened though. It's revealed that he's gone undercover and is trying to convince Black Manta, and by extension the Light in general, that he's genuinely joined up with them. Which is also a cool arc. But we don't get to see that arc. At this point, I have to ask, why? Why don't we get to see all this stuff? Well, Aqualad's arc shows us why. It's because the plot is taking precedence over the characters. It seems that the creators of the show decided that it was more important to surprise the audience than it was to see this arc. After all, if we saw what was going on with Aqualad, we would already know that he's not actually a traitor. This way we get two plot twists. First off, the idea that Aqualad has become a villain is a twist. Second, the fact that he hasn't actually done that is also a twist. I have no problems with plot twists, but I would much rather see an interesting character arc than have these twists. That's just more important to me, especially considering how much of this is interesting. These characters have changed so much, and Aqualad is no different. In concept, Aqualad's struggle is so interesting. He's lost so much and now he's confronting his father. He has to make so many difficult choices, all for the sake of his team's end goal, all while having other characters, in some cases his old teammates and friends, believing that he wants to kill them. But we get to see so little of the emotional side of this, of the character side of this, because the plot takes over completely. Sure, it's good to surprise your audience, but it's far better to connect with them. And the mistake that Young Justice Invasion made by doing this has a severe negative impact on the whole season. From the beginning, Young Justice seemingly hasn't had a protagonist. Sure, the main 6 heroes are obviously the most important out of all the characters, but they are decidedly the main 6. While it's tricky to pull off this sort of narrative, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, and a lot of the best aspects of Young Justice's first season came down to this broad focus and the different character stories that we got to see. In particular, I loved how Miss Martian's and Kid Flash's arcs were handled, though each of the other characters also had a lot going on. But I still believe the first season of Young Justice had a protagonist, even if it was pretty different from how I usually think of one. The whole team was a protagonist. After all, the narrative was about them growing closer to one another, learning to work together, sharing their secrets, and fighting against villains together. If we consider the team as one character per se, the writing in the first season makes a lot of sense. Robin, Aqualad, Superboy, Kid Flash, Miss Martian, and Artemis are all just different parts of that character. Different strengths and weaknesses, different memories and stories. Their individual character arcs are definitely there, but the most important arc is how they work together. In many ways, that group arc worked well, even if I did have some issues with that I outlined in my other videos on Young Justice. Young Justice Invasion is very different. After all, the group has changed so much. Now there are way more characters in the main team, and each of them is given some sort of focus. There's Batgirl, Beast Boy, Blue Beetle, Bumblebee, Guardian, Lagoon Boy, a new Robin, Static, Wonder Girl, and more. There's no one concept or core set of characters I can figure as the protagonist. This season is simply without one, and there's nothing wrong with that. But it is hard to write a story like that. Some of the best elements of Young Justice Invasion stem from this. The way characters clash and work together, often with slightly different goals or motivations, results in some of the most intense moments of the series. For example, there's this moment where Miss Martian brain blasts Aqualad, or when she's trying to fix him as Cheshire and Sportsmaster come in to avenge Artemis, who's really there disguised as Tigress and trying to figure out a way to get everyone out alive. All of the characters' motivations and actions make sense given the information available to them, but because of that they come to faulty conclusions, and the show is far more exciting for that. Sure, in these moments I listed, we have all the information, but who knows what might happen now? The plot manages to weave all over the place while still making sense because, past episode 7, we know the vast majority of what's going on. Now it's just about what characters will do with the limited information they have. In this way, dramatic irony is used to great effect in Young Justice Invasion, and results in a grand narrative that, despite its rocky beginnings, manages to twist and turn in an exciting fashion, while still feeling cohesive and, at least until some of the later episodes, satisfying. Though it's easy to think about how much better this would have been if we had seen more of the build up to it, more of what happened in that 5-year time skip, what is here still manages to be intense and frenetic. However, some of the worst parts of Young Justice Invasion stem from this too. Some characters' plots just kind of fizzle out. In particular, this is the case with Blue Beetle. Of course, he's worried about being controlled by the Reach, as Impulse has told him that, in the future, Blue Beetle's actions are part of what leads to a dystopian world. For some of the show, his worry about being controlled feels quite personal and has serious consequences. However, once a scarab is put under Reach control, we're removed from him, and it never ends up feeling like he's really all that tortured by the fact that he's doing the Reach's work. Since he was so worried about this outcome, it seems that we should see him being more worried and upset now that it's happened. But once again, the plot comes before the characters, and Blue Beetle being under the Reach's control is treated more as a plot twist than a character's struggle. The reason I bring this up here is because, if there were less characters overall, maybe I would have felt closer to Blue Beetle throughout the entire narrative. Instead, the story ends up getting fractured. I just feel too distant from these people at their most desperate moments. This is also the case with Artemis, when she's struggling with her own sense of identity while she's disguised as Tigress. Does it make sense that she might feel this way? Sure. But little is done beyond telling us that she feels this way to communicate that she feels this way. In other words, we're told through her own internal monologue that she's upset about this, but not so much through her interactions with others. There just isn't time for that. Again, if there were less characters, this probably wouldn't be as much the case. It may be ambitious to include so many characters, but I don't think it's advisable considering all that's going on. In fact, one of my favorite ideas in this season is about Roy Harper, otherwise known as Speedy, Red Arrow, or Arsenal. Yep, this fella's got a lot of names. Of course, that's because there's the original Roy and the clone Roy. Since the end of Young Justice's first season, the clone Roy has been on the hunt for the real one, obsessively searching for him, even though everyone else has given up on the idea that he's still alive. However, after Cheshire finds some information on him, he's able to go and save the original Roy. But the original one is bitter and angry about all he's lost, so he goes to kill Lex Luthor. Instead, he and Luthor end up in a standoff, and Luthor offers him a robotic arm. Unfortunately, this serves as a great example of how Young Justice Invasion drops interesting plots. After the original Roy goes and confronts Luthor, what happens to Green Arrow and Clone Roy? They just fade from the story. This would be fine if it seemed believable for their characters, but Green Arrow is clearly upset about what's happened with Arsenal, and it seems like the clone Roy is too. After all, he spent all this time searching for Roy. It's odd that he would leave things like this. Now, it's possible the clone Roy would do this, but if he made that decision, we need to see it. That's a huge character moment for him, for a character who has been important since the start of the series. And leaving it out or moving away from it for so long without an explanation is messy. Even more importantly, Cheshire remains in the story, so what happened to the clone Roy? Why isn't he doing anything to help her? Did she not tell him? Maybe. It's all up in the air, and that's exactly my problem with it. Even with a story that has so many characters, it's important to care about those characters. As it stands, even if there were moments where I cared, for the most part I just didn't. I found the exploration of their struggles to be surface level, especially when compared with the first season. Basically, there's nothing wrong with a story that doesn't have a protagonist, but it is a problem to have a story where the audience doesn't care about most of the characters in its large cast. And for me, that was how Young Justice Invasion felt. If you've seen my review of Young Justice's first season, then you already know that I had some problems with how villains in that series were handled. To summarize, I didn't like how so many villains were included because, to me, characterization was sacrificed for the sake of what effectively felt like cameos. Sure, having a whole ton of villains can be pretty cool from a world-building perspective, but I also need to care about and know something about those villains. In the first season, I felt less villains would have been better because then we could have seen more about the villains who were included, instead of seeing very little about a broad range of villains. On the surface, Young Justice Invasion seems to have improved in this regard. After all, the set of villains this time is far more consistent. The main villains in my mind are Black Beetle, the Reach Ambassador, Black Manta, and Lex Luthor. While other villains appear and are part of the plot, they either serve to manipulate others from the shadows with little screen time of their own, or they're brought in to serve a very specific role in the plot. The most pertinent example of the first type is Vandal Savage, while Simon and Mongol serve as good examples of the latter. Regardless, the most important thing is that a smaller group of villains is generally used here, despite the fact that there are a lot of other villains involved. Black Manta and Lex Luthor serve as the members of the Light that we see the most this season, while Black Beetle and the Reach Ambassador serve the same purpose but for the Reach. Even if I hope that we eventually see more of the other members of the Light, I think it's wiser to narrow the focus like this and slowly expand to include more members. Now, one thing I've already mentioned is that dramatic irony is one of Young Justice Invasion's strong points. This extends to the villains as well, as the Reach and the Light are both working against each other's interests, even while pretending to work together. It makes the audience even more uncertain of where exactly this is going to go, as it creates more possibilities for what could happen. Where it was almost certain in Season 1 that the events of that season would result in a battle between the members of Young Justice and the Light, things aren't so simple in Season 2. Sure, that could be the end result, but there's also the possibility that the heroes could end up having to join up with the Reach to take down the Light, or that they would end up with the Light to take down the Reach, or that the Light and the Reach come to a better agreement and work together to get rid of the heroes. All in all, the many possible outcomes of these events made me consistently curious about what was going to happen next during my first watch of this season. Unfortunately, the time skip once again makes this way less effective than it could have been. Sure, the idea of Black Manta and Aqualad's relationship is interesting, but in execution, not so much. I hadn't seen enough of them communicating for their final battle to hit all that hard. Yet again, I just didn't feel invested. And even if I didn't like how many of the villains were handled in the first season, at least I felt invested because I cared about the heroes. Here though, after being so removed from them for the sake of accelerating the plot, I just don't care that much. It's to be expected that if I didn't care about most of the characters in this show, the climax of the season will fall a bit flat for me. However, my main issue with it stems from one choice: to kill off Kid Flash. Now, I have no problem with killing off some characters. In fact, that's a good way to show how serious things are getting. To give the sense that no one's safe, to surprise the viewer, to take the story in a new direction. I could go on and on. There are lots of good reasons to kill off a character. So before going into why I dislike this, I want to go into some reasons this could be a good decision. First, he didn't really want to do this whole hero thing with Artemis anymore. There was serious concern there. Having him die in the final fight, having him sacrifice himself to save everyone despite wanting to give up on this for his and Artemis' sake, is pretty crushing. Plus, having him die is even more unexpected because we've seen so little of him this season. He's distanced, but that doesn't mean he's safe. So it feels like no one's safe from now on. But I still don't like it. I would rather have a satisfying arc than an unexpected death, and killing off Kid Flash this way really leaves me feeling that his character was horribly misused this season. In the first season, he had one of my favorite arcs. I mean, I went from really disliking the guy to liking him a whole lot, so having him go without a big arc here just left me feeling dissatisfied. Now, maybe he's not dead, but I also don't like that possibility. I hate when shows pretend to kill off characters, unless there is a really great reason to do so, because then it cheapens every single other character death. After one time of that happening to a major character in a way that's impossible to predict, I just go, well, they're probably coming back, who cares? That might bother me more than some other people, but hey, that's just how it goes with me, I guess. Overall, Kid Flash's death exemplifies what I don't like about this season. Plot comes first, characters come second. We're distanced from everyone throughout the whole season because of that, and none of the potentially awesome moments of the plot hit anywhere near as hard as they could because of that fact. Overall, Young Justice Invasion left me with a distinct feeling of disappointment. This season would have been great if we had just seen what the characters went through in that 5-year gap, if we had actually gotten to see their journey. As it stands, Young Justice Invasion took characters I liked, made them into strangers, and then tried to shock me with that fact. And was I shocked? Sure, I guess. But I wasn't invested, and to me, that matters way more. Those of you who have watched my Young Justice series from the beginning will know that I started off this season with the hopes of answering the question, is Young Justice as great as we remember? Now, of course, I can only answer this for myself, but I hope that you will leave your own opinions down in the comments below. The first important thing to mention here is that Young Justice is incomplete. The third season is currently ongoing, and season 2 ends on a cliffhanger. However, based on the question, is it as great as we remember, I'm going to just focus on these first 2 seasons. Maybe I'll cover the third season later, but I haven't seen it yet, and at this time it isn't complete. To put it simply, no, I don't think Young Justice is great. While I enjoyed the first season thoroughly, I had significant problems with how it handled its overall plot and climax. Meanwhile, while I saw a lot of potential in the second season's plot means very little to me without characters to care about. The distance created between the viewer and the characters in Season 2 stopped me from getting invested for a long time, and even then, certain plots I cared about were dropped or wrapped up in a far from satisfactory manner. If the second season had built upon the first one, if I had continued to feel close to these characters, then I think this show could have been great. But unfortunately, that's just not the show that's here.